بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد والصلاة والسلام على أهله وأصحابه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh to everyone. Today, I'm excited today actually. We're joined by Dr. Yakoob Ahmed, who probably needs very little introduction, or at least I think so. But but that leads me to the reason why I'm excited, because my background is history, history PhD and all that sort of stuff. So it's very rare that I get to speak to Muslim historians.
Yeah,
um, do you find that?
all the time. All the time.
You get
Yeah.
that as well. Yeah,
All the
it's.
time.
I don't think I'm a proper Muslim historian. I did kind of do the whole PhD thing, and then I didn't. I kind of stopped research. I write here and there, but you're proper, like you were an academic for a long time.
Yeah, but no, you're qualified. That's what that matters. The skills never leave you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But how was your experience as a Muslim? I know you talk about it in your book. Let me introduce the book first, because that's what we're going to kind of be talking about. And this is the book, Why History Matters, and it's great. It's really good. We'll get into the detail of it in a minute. Actually, I really like the cover as well. It's got like a little vinely kind of feeling.
Yeah, that's right.
And obviously it folds out, which is really cool.
Yeah.
And that's on the website, isn't it? Ketaba Publishing website. They can order that from.
It's on Ketebe, it's on Cube, and in America it's on Mecca Books, I think.
Okay, so those are the places you can order it, and we'll get into the discussion of that. Discussion in the book in a minute, but yeah, I want to find out your experience first about because I think it lends itself actually to the subject anyway.
Yeah.
How did you find studying history at SOAS, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So, well, first of all, Salaam alaikum, everyone. I'm really sorry for being rude. So us was both good and bad. I mean, no, bad is a harsh term. It wasn't. There were moments. I mean, look, you're dealing with an institution where Orientalism is infused in the walls and the fabric of the institution. Having said that, there are a lot of academics in SOAS who are inclined to critiquing Orientalism, but nonetheless, um, there is an authorization that takes place regarding Islam, no matter how well intentioned anyone is. So we as Muslims, and there was many of us, we had our moments in the classroom where we had to continuously navigate, academics saying things like, we're going to talk about Abbasid history, but we're going to leave Allah outside of the classroom today. And, we would look at each other and think, okay, firstly, is that comment even necessary? And secondly, what is going on here? And then, but the corridors, the staff rooms or the student union rooms and so forth, they were great, engaging with other people from different backgrounds and different sort of like ideas and so forth. That helps you grow. So in that sense, SARS was great. It was the students that primarily made that university what it was, but there were a few academics that I would have to say were also influential and sort of like guiding me in terms of training. So I can't deny that for sure.
It's interesting about the Abbasid comment. I know you make the same point in the book as well, actually. But yeah, as I read it and as you just said it now, it just like automatically I'm like, actually, when you talk about a lot of Western history, particularly the Crusades, that sort of stuff, or like the Tudors,
Yeah,
which is so common. It's so common here in the UK to study the Tudors. There's a lot of actually they do bring in religion and God into classroom, right? And then the Tudors, for those who aren't aware of British history and the British curriculum, is a period in history, obviously, from what was it, roughly the end of the 15th century to the end of the 16th century, thereabouts. Henry VIII and all of that sort of stuff. And then I think the big thing is, isn't it? It's kind of like the experience of Henry VIII, his experience of religion,
yeah.
and fighting with the Catholic Church. So it's just like very apparent in their history.
I'll be honest, like, sorry to interrupt, but like someone
Right.
said to me in one of the book tours I was doing, they came to me and said, "Look, don't you think that you should you should change the way that you've spoken in the book as a way of accommodating non-Muslims?" And more recently, someone else said, "Don't you think you should have changed the title to make it sound like it was more Muslim specific. And my answer to both of those is no. Actually, the argument I'd made a few days ago was I would like to see something like this at Waterstones, not because I have a complex that I want to be recognized by Waterstones, but for the fact of why can't a book like this sit on a shelf in Waterstones? I mean, I've been watching Japanese anime since I was a kid. And Japanese anime primarily was not designed for a global audience. It was designed for purely Japanese audience. It just happened to go viral and global because of the internet. And people around the world have acclimatized to terminologies, to cultures, to cultural nuances, to religious or traditions, philosophies that are engaged within that genre. And people have learned to embrace it and debate with it in their own terms. And yet, why can't we write from a perspective which is holistically Islamic and expect even a non-Muslim reader to be able to enjoy it and engage with it and accept it for the tradition that it is? And I just find that strange, and I find it strange because it usually that is coming from Muslims saying that because they have some sort of fear that mentioning the name of Allah or speaking in a way in which you're trying to curate a lived experience of what Muslims live. Um, it has to be toned down or secularized for it to be palatable, and I'm just not sure if we need to do that anymore. If academia, for example, is supposed to presents itself as lending towards a space of plurality, then surely there should be some space at least for the thinker in the academic space to be able to push those boundaries a little bit, to be able to be outwardly Muslim, perhaps. And I mentioned C.S. Lewis and Tolkien to one of the people that asked me the question. And they said, yeah, but he did it. They did it subtly. I said, did they? Was it
Mm,
really subtle? Are you kidding me? Everyone knows that Aslan was like, and uh, was supposed to be like in Lewis's idea of Jesus and
yeah,
so forth, and everyone knew the characters in Lord of the Rings, and from Gandalf representing the particular resurrection to Aragorn representing the king with Christ for them being the king to Frodo, and it's not hidden. So I think going forward, what I would like to see is both in the fictional space and in the academic space, perhaps, that Muslims being proud of their sort of like heritage and just being authentically Muslim and trusting that non-Muslims will read that and engage with it. I mean, I said to one person, "You're nervous about the way that I'm speaking. Then what about the Quran? Like you guys are
mm,
dishing them out all the time." So, to some degree, this is how I feel about this now, and this is sort of the intervention I was sort of like posing, and it's that years of experience at SOAS actually of being told to tone down.
See, that's really interesting to me because so when I was at King's, one of my supervisors was Richard Drayton, who you're probably familiar with. But he wrote an article which I really kind of was really enlightened by actually. I can't remember the exact title, but it's something like "Writing History from Below," and it was a history of empire writing it from below, right? And his argument effectively or essentially was we need to have a wider array of voices other than just kind of like I might have mentioned this on the podcast previously actually, but in Kings we had this saying, we don't want to have the stale male and pale, which was the kind of like the male and the stale kind of cliched, right history. But yeah, his whole argument was exactly that. It was actually we need to have history from the people who have experienced it, rather than being kind of like being forced to, listen to those who, you know,
Absolutely.
like
Well, I was
yeah,
being a bit more. I was being a bit more controversial. I was saying I want history from above, but above in the sense of Allah
Allah,
Ta'ala. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely, right. Which is like totally above. Um, but and that I think that's the imposition that irked me the most. I've experienced throughout my time in the academic space, both in Turkey and in the West, at various conferences or workshops, both subtle and overt forms of Islamophobia. It's
yeah,
you get gaslit in ways to you get attacked and challenged as if the positions you're putting forward are not worthy or even intellectual. Right? I've mentioned this before. You get accused for this idea called devotional bias, right? This idea
Mm.
that because you're a Muslim, you have a devotional bias towards anything you write regarding Islam. And yet, I could handle all of that. What I think just irked me the most was the audacity and the hubris of human beings to say, well, we're just going to put Allah into a box. And I'm like, how dare you? How dare you? That this is just not the way Muslim writers were thinking when they were writing. So it's bizarre that I can read Ibn Khaldun, I can't be Ibn Khaldun, you know,
Yeah,
and that doesn't make sense to me.
yeah, yeah, it's Ibn Khaldun, actually, funnily enough, Ibn Khaldun, I remember being on some of the undergrad stuff that we did, particularly his Muqaddamah, and it was in the libraries. It was in the King's Library, and I'm pretty sure they had it in the Oxford Library as well. But they had like Arabic lexicons, definitely in the Oxford libraries. So it's really interesting that they kind of like segment it. And I think I've mentioned this previously in some talks I've done about the Islamic golden era, right?
Yeah,
And it not actually being what we might consider the golden era, which
yeah,
is
that's right.
the time being of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, his life, the seerah.
Yeah,
But it goes to serve a particular narrative.
yeah,
And I think, I don't know how you found it, but from my perspective, I have seen a lot of like Muslims talk about that, 1001 inventions. And I
yeah.
don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I don't think it's necessarily kind of intentionally being, and it's not intentionally kind of like being
No,
a particular
no, I
narrative,
know
but
where it's coming. I have an inkling of where it's coming from, which is that in the last century or so, there has been a particular projection by the West about its scientific achievements. The idea or the notion of progress is predicated on this idea of technological and scientific achievements. Even a Nobel Peace Prize is an exercise of patting yourself on the back, but it's an exercise of science and tech primarily, right? And so, some way down the line, Muslims have felt sort of like isolated from this conversation, even though they're in every field of science and tech. And they want to show that there was a time where we also invented stuff. And that's just bizarre for me because Muslims have never had that sort of complex historically. We borrow when we need to, and we invent when we need to. We engage with other ideas when we need to, and we curate or sub curate ideas when we need to, so long as we put it through the filter, which is Islam. That's it. That's what we're interested in. We're not interested in being the first at anything, in many ways, to prove a point. What we try to do within any of our sort of like works, historically, we've noticed, is to try to make something which is for the betterment of humanity, if that can be the case. And even if it's not the case, it doesn't really matter. It's not the, I mean, primarily, I always say to people, and this is where I get kind of confused, that Rasul Sallam's time is the golden age for Islam and Islamic history. That's the pinnacle of humanity in many ways.
mm,
And what is the key components of Rasul Sallam? It's the value system that he represents. Actually, it's the sort of like the effort, the ideas, the principles, the creed. It's not about his technological and scientific advancements. And that's how we judge societies. Like so, today, one could argue that we are probably the most technologically advanced people in the history of this particular period of. But yet, what has happened to our collective value system? It's debunked in a way. It's been debunked in a way that's scary, in the sense that so much has come out on the internet to sort of show a mirror to humanity at the moment, to sort of like debunk this idea that we are actually, the most civilized people ever known to man. It's just not true, right? And so Muslims need to change their orientation. And and Firaz won't mind me saying this. I mean, because Firaz and I, we've spoken about this, Firaz al-Khatib. Like, his book
yeah,
on Islamic civilization is still the number one book that Muslims read on Islamic history. And he wrote that as a undergrad thesis, and it's sitting in a shelf in Waterstone still. I was last week, just happened to see it. And it's like, we need something else apart from that. We need to have different types of contributions, perhaps.
absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, yeah, that for us book. Yeah, I think I've got a copy here somewhere as well, actually.
Yeah,
um, uh, I think we've kind of skipped a step in this discussion. And I think we assume although I think you devote a good part of your book to this discussion, I think we assume we people understand what we mean by history, or what
Right,
history is,
right.
and that's not always true, right? And maybe that's partly why people are so drawn to Faraz's books. It's like it's very bite-sized, it's very kind of like easy read.
Yeah.
So I know you spend some time in your book discussing this, but could you unpack that a little bit for us? What exactly is history from a historian's point of view?
Well, for me, it's a discipline, right? And it's not just an endeavor of just telling you a sort of like chronological story of facts, which is what seems to have happened to some degree. I try to give it those layers, and the fact to say that history is about time, history is about memory, history is about identity, and history fundamentally is about understanding at the core essence the disposition of what it means to be human. And then what we do is we examine various moments in the human experience, and we try to find meaning from that in any shape or form, and try to see what it is that we can take from that collective human experience. And for me, that's fundamentally what the historian is trying to do. And you know, yes, I could write the history of some nuance or specific subject as an academic, but primarily, I think what benefits human beings is when you can provide for them, at least, and this was the argument I put in the book from an Islamic perspective, is some sort of value add, some sort of morals or lessons, or you know, increase their iman, or give them some sort of insight or even foresight, perhaps. And so, the historian, in that sense, fundamentally, is an intellectual, right? And we know this, that in the field of the humanities, and professors in the humanities themselves are complaining about this, which is that they feel that the humanities has been undercut for
Yeah,
STEM, and in the current period we're in, that there's an intellectual decline in the West as well, because the humanities was that supreme premier space in which intellectuals were curated, and the way that they were done is by engaging with ideas, thoughts, practices of what human beings have done in the past. I was only speaking to someone today. I bumped into a brother who recognized me at a restaurant, and he was reading one of the classics, Penguin classics. And I said to him, "Keep reading it, because one of the great things about classics is that it disrupts your understanding of modernity in many ways, where you read about a time in history, even if it's fictional, but it curates a world about a time in history that was, in some ways, similar to today, in the sense that human beings are very similar, but different than today, in the sense of making us understand that, you know, they were also sophisticated civilizations, they were sophisticated people. I'll give you an example. I was giving a talk in Manchester recently, and I was because I'm writing a new book on the relationship between Jibreel alayhi salam and Rasul sallam. And so I was reading the hadith out loud about when Rasul sallam is in the cave of Hira, and Jibreel alayhi salam comes and he squeezes him. And I asked, like, how do you imagine that Jibreel alayhi salam squeezes him, Rasul sallam? And one person in the audience made this squeeze and motion. And I said, does the hadith mention that Jibreel alayhi salam came as a human form? It doesn't.
yeah,
That's the imagination, contemporary imagination we have, because we've somehow put into our heads that he came in the human form in the cave. But it doesn't say that. It just says that, Rasulullah was told to recite, and then he was enveloped by Jibreel alayhi salam, and he felt like he was, you know, stricken or suffocating and so forth. Now that's a different type of imagination. That now opens the possibilities of thinking about that first interaction in a different way, and there could be a far more humane and gentler way of probably explaining that once you understand how this hadith is operating. But today's imagination, we get so stuck in how we see the world today, that we make these assumptions, and these assumptions become ingrained, and they're never challenged. And I think as historians, one of the things that we try to do is explore the possibility of deconstructing that.
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I think what you're saying about imagination,
Mhm.
and how people kind of it's very anachronistic at times. Imagine kind of it's one of the things I'm kind of battling with currently. I think especially in what's the phrase that guy uses? techno-feudalism, kind of
Yeah.
this era of techno-feudalism, which I'm still kind of like, reading about. We live in a warped world. We live in a warped reality.
It's warped, it's myopic, and it's
Yeah.
narrow, and it's atomized. And so, one of the interesting things about the idea of imagination, perhaps, is the assumption that imagination, or one only exercise the use of their imagination when it comes to mythologizing something, or turning something into fiction, or so on. And yet, that's just not the case. I mean, we are required to use our imagination all the time, from Allah Ta'ala explaining to us what Jannah is like in the Quran, to imagining the phenomena of what things have happened, what to things that have happened to people in the past. You require an imagination. Now, what we try to do, historians perhaps, is we try to curate an understanding in which the imagination is as accurate as we can expect it to be. But what people don't realize is sometimes they all exercise imagination. And their imaginations can be skewed. And so the imagination that we require is not some sort of like deficiency in people. It's a necessity in people. And that's the key. And like and this is not a blast on Yaqeen Institute or anything of that nature, but they recently done the Salahuddin series, and I'm pleased that that's happened. But the AI generation that I was looking at, it caught me off guard a little bit, because what that was doing is that was curating an imagination for the contemporary audience, and that's probably not how it looked at the time. And it was constructing in many ways people to assume that that's how it is, especially from the generation of, so it's been generated from the internet, which doesn't have a soul. Is problematic for me, because it's presenting it in a way which for me feels soulless, and that is another concern I have. So imagination, which is really important for human beings, even that, there needs to be a level of decorum and honesty and trust in the way that we sort of like curate and speak about how to use our imagination, right?
Mm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, I'm trying to phrase this in a way that's not kind of like, I don't ever like to kind of bash the ummah, but sometimes I inadvertently. So I think in our collective imagination, at least up until recently, I think we've had this kind of like collective imagination of our past as being, like the Khilafah, and it was great, and it was amazing, and so on and so forth, right? And do you think that that's kind of like been curated by poor, history, and kind of poor
This is
kind
an
of
interesting question, because when I made the case of writing a work that's man orientated, naturally some people just simply accused me of assuming, or they were assuming that I'm trying to make the case for nostalgia and
yeah,
writing
yeah,
history as
right.
as a happy place, and that's not the point I was making. And I don't know why that is the assumption, that if you make something which is iman orientated, that iman orientated has to be something which is continuously celebrating particular events. No, there are times where we need to examine the reality of the darkness of the human experience. I mean,
Mm,
that is necessary. And I think the nuance and the complexity, when a historian provides it from that perspective, it can actually help people. A lot of my students, when they would read about, for example, some of the trials and tribulations of the Sahaba during the period of the Khulafa Rashidun, especially Uthman bin Affan and Ali radiallahu anhum, it was painful for them. But then, as a historian, somebody who's a bit more mature would help them navigate those moments and would explain it to them in a particular way, so that it doesn't impact their iman and their taqwa in any shape or form. So, in actuality, a good historian is not simply trying to glorify the past, because what it does is, if you skew that sort of like history writing for it to just be that, then it will leave people very despondent
mm,
in many ways. It will make them despondent, firstly, because they will look at the reality of the lived experience and think, well, why is my life not like that? And that's maybe not achievable, and only people of the past can do something of that nature, and we're in a different era. Or they might read the history of the past and then come to realize the reality of the past, and then totally shake their foundations about the nature of what it means to be Muslims. And that's not what I think we should be doing. What we should be doing is being mature about writing about those difficult moments, um, but doing it in a way to help people understand that this is the nature of human beings. So when people, for example, ask me why did the Ottoman princes compete with each other
Right.
for the Sultanate, I would always say everybody knows somebody that's competing about inheritance in a Muslim household. Human beings do that, and once they understand that, they say, "Look, it is what it is," and that's
Yeah.
also another point I make in the book, which is I think while it's important to talk about maybe positive things and negative things, we shouldn't get too caught up in looking at the brushstrokes and avoiding the importance of the painting by and large, which is that by and large, civilizationally, Islam has offered goodness to humanity. But there have been moments in details you can see where Muslims, just like anyone else, have committed acts where they should be held accountable to the standards of Allah Ta'ala. But by and large, Islam, if you present it like that, I think is a lot more wholesome for people to understand in terms of their lived experience.
Mm. I think that lived experience bit is really, and I keep returning to it, don't we? But I think it's so important. I think it's really what I think you're a good again maybe the core, a good chunk of your book is about. Um, so I guess in terms of the lived experience, how do we kind of start to bridge that gap between and maybe this is going slightly from a tangent between kind of like that kind of a romantic vision of history that we have and our kind of current political global malaise that we're kind of in, because I think a lot of the times, we talk about Salahuddin. It's like if Salahuddin was here, we wouldn't be in this problem. If whatever was, we wouldn't be in this problem. We look back at this like really great historic past.
It's amazing. We don't only look at this great historic past, but even we fast forward to the Mahdi. So we've got this complex, which is either the Mahdi will come and save us, or we, if only we were like Salahuddin Ayyubi. So it's weird how we've posited ourselves in the timeline of time, where we've kind of, not all of us, but there is a segment, at least in the communities, where they've sort of like abandoned the idea of that they have any agency.
Right.
And that's not the case. I keep reminding them that look, firstly, well, you can be the next Salahuddin if you want. That's not rocket science. You have to those. That's the reason why we read these works. And secondly, if you're waiting for the Mahdi, but the Mahdi doesn't come out of a vacuum, you have to prepare conditions for the Mahdi to come into, because that's the whole point of the ideal Salahuddin. That the only reason why Salahuddin is successful in what he does is because prior to that you have Nuruddin Zengi and Ahmadiddin Zengi and this whole ecosystem that stretches all the way back to the Seljuk periods. In fact, that ecosystem comes into existence even during the Crusades. But during the Crusades, it wasn't able to stop that. But nonetheless, those infrastructures and institutions and ideas permitted the conditions eventually for someone like Salahuddin to just put the cherry on the cake. And that's what we need to do. So whether we're looking backwards or forwards, I mean, I think what we need to convince Muslims by is that fundamentally, first, you exist, you're here, and and how do you want to be known in history? Like when people in the future write about you, or when we're
Mm.
writing history real time, how do you want to be seen? How do you want to be projected as? And so that requires then people to have a more positive disposition, and to understand that in many ways your iman and taqwa is no different than the people that came before you. It comes down to your effort and how you see yourself. And Islam hasn't ended; it's still here. uh, you know um, and this is why I don't only try to, when I'm teaching in person, don't only try to teach history like I've said this in the book, that sometimes history feels like a faraway place. History can be taught from what happened 10 years ago or 2 years ago or last year. These are not, in many ways we can still, I can write a book on what's happened in the last 5 years in regards to the collective Muslim experience, or what's happened in Palestine, or what's happened in whatnot. That's still history.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Palestine, I mean, unavoidable
Yes.
topic. I think really it's a narrative, right?
Yeah.
Um, it's there's a lot. Again, it's a difficult question to grapple with, right? So I think there has been a shift in globally in the narrative, not just for Muslims, but like the kind of vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine. Massive shift, right? Um, However, I think one thing that still kind of plagues me and troubles me is that we compartmentalize the part of the Ummah that is Palestine, and then we compartmentalize, or we don't actually even think really about people in Sudan, right? And the reason I say that is I think there's a political kind of problem here, because we talk about justice for people of Palestine as we rightly should.
Yeah.
And yet it's inconvenient for us to talk about justice for Sudan or the justice for Uyghurs, because that's kind of like, hold on, we live in this narrative, again, to use that word, narrative of this bipolar world, and the UAE states, the Khalij states, are, uh, are having to toe this line with the states, and therefore they have to do this stuff in Sudan or whatever it is, and we have to support China because they're the only kind of counterbalance to this Pax Americana. Um, so, in terms of narrative around that sort of stuff, that around the complexities of kind of our modern political issues, how do we begin to kind of incorporate the lived experiences of our global ummah?
I think there has to be a consistency in what it is that we're doing in terms of work. I mean, look, there is a uniqueness regarding Palestine. I think that um, is unique in the sense that one is, Beit al-Maqdis and Aqsa is an Aqidah issue. So I understand that. Secondly,
Mm,
it's an issue that's been going on since 48 and so on. And so it's an issue which I wouldn't say people are well informed about, but it's an issue that people are informed about at least. Whereas the other issues that we talk about, they somehow are lost in the collective imagination because to some degree, that's information that's not filtering or making its way to the communities in the ways that it should, and that's our responsibility. Our responsibility then, as people who are educated in some shape or form, is to bring those narratives back onto the table, so that people can aptly understand the complexities of what's happening in the world and that the suffering is in multiple places. Look, I'll give you an example. When I was living in Japan, I went to the Philippines, and Sultan Kudrat is one of the major like founding figures in Filipino history, and he was a chieftain who fought against, I think it was the Spanish or the Portuguese, I can't remember, but they're sort of like colonial intentions, and was seen as a hero and a freedom fighter. He's Muslim. There was another guy in Mindanao called Lapu Lapu, once again Muslim. Now, what's interesting is many people in the Philippines didn't know that, but outside the Philippines, people don't even know they existed. I went to Thailand, and there was a mosque in Thailand that I went to pray at, which was commissioned by Sultan Abdul Hamid II. The locals didn't know that. And so what's happening is this sort of like erasure of Muslim history and out of the Muslim consciousness. It fascinates me how, let's just say, the Far East, so Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, China, Thailand, you know, Myanmar, and so forth. That's not even part of the imagination in regards to Islam's presence there, and even parts of West Africa and South Africa and so forth. Africa is a Muslim continent, more or less. And so, what's happened is, I guess, is the manner in which information has come to us in the last 50, 60 years has been very narrow. And so, as a result of that, we have become quite dislocated from each other. And I think that's slowly changing. The fact that you
yeah,
asked that question isn't of itself an indication, or the point you made is an indication that there are quite a few people now who are asking the case, okay, we need to be better informed and more informed. And that means that Muslims need to produce more literature about themselves. Now, I'll give you an example. In Japan, there are 23 Ottoman historians in Japan.
oh, okay,
Go to
wow,
Pakistan go to Pakistan and ask how many Ottoman historians exist in Pakistan.
yeah,
You'd be lucky to find one.
yeah, yeah.
So something has gone wrong here in terms of us documented, collecting and writing about our past and being able to tell our stories to each other. Something has gone wrong there.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting you say that actually, and I want to link it into something you said previously about fiction and stories. So I think it's more palatable. History tends to be more palatable to non-history nerds when it's fiction, right? And I this is an example of this epic poem. It's genre epic called Padmavat. And maybe I don't know if you've heard of it, come across it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for those who are not familiar with this is like it was written by a Muslim, a
Mhm.
Muslim guy wrote this, um, and it's about the kind of sack of Rajasthan, some Rajput, not Rajasthan, some Rajput king, and he has this wife or concubine, whatever it was, called Padmavat. And then like the crescendo of this whole poem is, once they have taken over this fort, the Muslims taken over this fort, Alauddin Khilji, Padmavat goes and like jumps on the funeral fire of her husband, and it's like it is such a rallying call for the Hindutva. They had a film come out in, I want to say, 2016, roughly thereabouts, and it's like it's a huge, like completely fictionalized
Is this
story.
Padmavati? Is that
Padmavati,
the
yeah,
movie?
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, that's
I
yeah,
watched that. It's a good
Padmavati.
movie, but yeah, the narrative is wrong. But in terms of cinematics, it's good good viewing. Unfortunately,
But yeah, I've boycotted Bollywood for a long time, so I've not watched anything since then. But yeah, I've heard it's got good reviews. But it's such a massive rallying call for Hindutva, right? And they've built a massive
and the
identity.
way they portrayed Muslims in there is just
Oh,
savages,
it's
basically.
terrible.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's terrible. Yeah, yeah. Alauddin Khilji is just like he's supposed to be this like savage guy who's like just out for blood. Um, which I'm not sure if that ties in with the original poem or not, but it's huge, and we don't have anything like that. Not really. We don't have any kind of like literature as a global Muslim kind of ummah that brings us
So
together in that
this is one of the interventions that I made in the book, which was there's a section on fiction, as you know, in there,
yeah,
and
yeah,
some people asked me when I was writing at the time, what's this got to do with history? And I said, well, actually, it's got everything to do with history,
yeah.
in the sense that one of the concerns I have is that at the moment, because of social media and people's abilities to use YouTube and these various different platforms, that we are fictionalizing history in many ways. We're turning the discipline of history into some sort of storytelling fictional format, which I'm not happy with. And then on the other hand, we are not doing an apt job of fictional works in the sense that we're telling people, or we're not telling people to do fiction, and so the distinction is just not there. There's a blurring of lines, and in fact, what I believe is that there is a need for good fictional writing. There are works in English being written in fiction mainly by women writers. We have a dearth of male writers, which is interesting regarding fictional work. And I mentioned this in one of my Substack ramblings about how Muslim men in particular have sort of abandoned the creative spaces. We were architects. Like if you go into the field of calligraphy today, all the calligraphers in the Ottoman Empire were men, but now you go into a calligraphy class, and
Right,
very
yeah.
rarely do you find any Muslim men doing calligraphy, even though the masters in Turkey are primarily men. From architects to fictional works to all sorts, and I think that concerns me, not because I don't think women should be doing that. That's not the point I'm making, and I don't want people to sort of misunderstand that. But we do need men to go into these fields to have a wholesome sort of like representation of the creative arts in many ways, and fiction is important. It has been part of the tradition. Muslims have been doing poetry for centuries, since the time of Rasulullah. Muslims have been writing fictional works and so on, and sometimes, and I say this in the book, which is you can really give truth meaning by writing fictional works, in the sense that once we know it's fictional, like Diraris Outrage, it's not real. You know what I mean? And I'm sorry if there's any Muslims who get offended by that. It's historical fiction, but it works because that's what fiction does. And then history has its own place in which good writing in history matters. Good storytelling in the way that we curate our narratives in history writing also matters. But at the moment, we are undercutting the two. And it's funny you say that, because in the field of Ottoman studies, There's Najib Fazl was a fictional writer, and he did a fictional biography of Abdul Hamid II. And historians for years thought it was a biography, an actual biography. It was
Yeah.
all fictional, and that sort of like detachment that people have is similar to what you talk about Padmavati in many ways. Even though you gave away the spoiler, so I'm not going to be watching the movie anymore. But okay, this is a joke, by the way. I haven't seen them all, so I'm similar to you. I no longer choose to watch movies from Bollywood because of what they represent in many ways. Even more recently, I was intrigued about seeing how they depicted Aurangzeb, but then I chose not to watch the movie once again. Um, and this is something I think we grapple with. And I think I made the argument that a good fictional writer still requires a historical consciousness so that they can curate their stories. And I've said this before. I've heard some people say we need an Islamic Dune or an Islamic Star Wars. No, we don't. Write your own stories. Like, come on, why are your imaginations coming or being given to you from the outside? Just write your stories. We've got a wonderful repository of 1400 years. You don't even have to use our repository. You can use other repositories. It's fine, so long as you can put it and curate it in a style that can resonate with the audience that we want to speak to.
Absolutely. I tend to find that even when we kind of like not necessarily fictionalize, but maybe kind of like maybe have apocryphal stories.
Mm,
Like you have like certain stories about Umar ibn Khattab, right, which may be kind of like slightly embellished or slightly kind of like it's really more to do a moral lesson.
yeah,
It's really more
yeah,
of a moral lesson than it is kind of like here's an
yeah,
identity, here's something you can resonate with in your current situation, or here's something you can kind of like identify with,
right.
right? It's like no, here's a moral lesson for you to take, and I found that with the Umar series, which was, I mean, it was well done. It was high production values and so on, but it's again, it's like, does it increase my love for Umar? Yes. Okay. Yeah, I understand him a little bit better. I understand him, radiallahu anhu, but it's kind of like you're moralizing. You're not really giving me something to get my teeth into in terms of fiction, right?
Yeah,
Um,
and look, if people are going to do that, I understand that, but just make it clear that that's what you're doing. You know, like audiences in the past understood there's an assumption that audience in the past somehow, uh, because we believe we're more literate today in terms of our reading and writing abilities, that audience in the past were somehow ignorant. That's not the case. They were well informed. They just not everybody knew how to read and write. They were still mature audiences, and they understood what they were engaging with. Whereas I feel like today, even though we've become more literate, there is some I don't know what's happened, but the amount of misinformation and falsehood that's now being put out there is far more worrying for me, to be honest.
mm, um, I want to come on to subjectivity and objectivity. I know we had a
Yeah.
discussion about this the other day, actually, and you mentioned this in your book as well. And I can't remember where it was. I think it's in the first third, thereabouts. I think, but you mention it in a particular way, subjectivity and objectivity, and you're basically saying, I can't remember the exact wording you used, but effectively it was something like, we don't need to be objective, and that's not something that's even a good thing necessarily. Being subjective is probably a better thing for us to kind of try and achieve. And I think it
Yeah.
goes back to that whole thing about actually the lived experience, right? Um, and well, yeah, I mean, firstly, yeah, could you just explain that? Could you explain kind of
Well,
like why that's
I,
important?
I think we should as human beings just be honest. So I was presenting recently, and a person in the audience asked me that. He goes, "Don't you think we should be objective in the way that we do history?" And I asked him, "Well, what do you mean? What does that mean exactly when you're being objective?" So he says, for example, if I'm writing about the people of South America, and I will try to be as honest as possible. And I'm saying, well, why do you assume that subjective writing cannot be honest? I said, we're subjective in the fact that we are selective in the way that we compile the information, and we're selective in the words that we choose, to the way that we explain the phenomena and the experience. In that sense, we are trying to be objective in the sense that we are truth seekers, but fundamentally, we are subjective because everything is driven by some sort of worldview or ideology. I said, Marxist history is not objective. Leftist history is not objective. Environmentalist history is not objective. The Arnold School, the Frankfurt School, the Cambridge School, these are not objective. They're driven by a particular ideological framing. So the assumption that secular writing in particular, and this is the argument that I guess most people are making, that secular writing is a reflection of objectivity, I reject that. I think that it's a reflection of a particular type of subjectivity. And nobody in the field of history will deny that. I mean, speak to a well versed historian and they'll accept it. But it's made its way into the public sphere, that in the public sphere there is a belief that history writing is objective, and that concerns me. Why? The reason why I had to tackle this question is because I'm Muslims reading so many history books and then thinking it must be true because I read this book. And you and I both know this, that history writing actually, and being a historian, is not about reading one book and saying that's true, but navigating these various multiple interpretations of the same event or the same moment or the same ideas. And that historians conceptually don't even agree on many things. And that's just normal. And in fact, I was at a conference once when an academic said that there should be some level of conceptual consistency. And I said, I'm not sure that's okay, because even in that conceptual consistency, there are gatekeepers that determine that conceptual consistency. And that doesn't make sense either. So I'm just basically being honest and saying, look, what is required from me as a Muslim is to be truthful. That the truth is the endeavor here. We're trying to establish what is the truth, and we are limited with the materials that are in front of us, to the information that's in front of us, to our own human deficiencies. And then we try to put that together to make it palatable for the person who's reading it in the form that we put it forward. And that is our subjectivity, and that's okay.
This is the thing, right? I think this is, I think, the point which Drayton was making as well about kind of history from below and subjectivity, and it's actually history isn't. And this, I think you mentioned the Whig school as well in your book at some point. But these kind of, and the Cambridge School and these kind of historiographies or schools of history
Yeah,
try to create, well, not try to create, but they tried to kind of like legitimize empire, legitimize colonialism. Their logic,
that's right.
um, and the same with the Marxists. You know, kind of pretty much.
Well, I've
They
said
try.
this before, that Marxist history at times can feel sympathetic towards Muslims, but it's very antagonistic towards Allah.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah, absolutely, yeah,
do you know what I mean?
yeah,
And this is something that really does concern me. And going on to those ideas of schools, because somebody asked me like recently, like, because I was thinking and I'm endeavoring about the idea of methodology, about can there be a methodology about writing history in the contemporary sense. And the idea that I'm positing here is not that I want a Yakoob Ahmed's methodology of writing history. Actually, I want to encourage an Islamic contemporary school of history writing. I'm happy to have plurality amongst Muslim historians, and that we can differ on things and we can critique each other. But by and large, the canopy that we think from is from the Islamic prism. That sort of like school of history writing can take place. And so I've been asked, but that's never been done before. And I said, yeah, it's not been done before because in the time of Khaldun or Masudi or Ibn Kathir or whoever the historian might have been, or Jevdet Pasha, Islam was the zeitgeist. Everybody was living under Islam. There was no need to engage with these various ideologies. They didn't need to deal with Foucauldian thought or, Walter Mignolo, the decolonialist or whatever. But now this is here. And just like how Muslims navigated uh, Greek philosophy, I think today in the contemporary form, Muslims can navigate these various different um, you
mm,
know, uh, ideas that have emerged regarding the field of history, and they can put it through the Islamic filter. And what I mean by that is this is not an attempt to, decolonize or to Islamize. This is an attempt to go back to the tradition, because we have a tradition that does history, and make it palatable for the contemporary form. That's all I'm asking. Do you know what I mean? And I'm not
yeah.
sure. I don't think that's that outrageous, personally.
No, 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 I agree. But just because you mentioned him, right? Just because you mentioned it, how do you find this or situate this differently to Walter Mignolo's kind of ideas of nativist, going back to your native roots and kind of like your own epistemology and your kind of, what's the phrase he uses? The kind of like 0 point of your epistemology. How do you, or is it the same, or is it?
Well, no. So what I try to do then is just to go into the tradition itself. and then say, well, what is the epistemology of the tradition, right? And this is the point. I'm, you know, there was an assumption made more recently that sort of like an iman orientated approach of writing history can't be in conformity with the radical tradition of writing history. It can. You know, these are not separate. You know, you can still write history where it can be critical and decolonial, but still be put through the filter of
Iman, yeah.
Islam. Fundamentally, it talks to the Muslim audience. I don't see why we can't find ways of trying to experiment to try to find a medium in which that is possible. You know, and this is what I'm trying to propose, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah. So I think I find, and I think this may be kind of the core. I don't know, maybe not. But maybe one of the problems we're facing is that I think as an ummah, or maybe just the West. I don't know if I can say the Ummah. Maybe it's just the West. We tend to look at our history either, I think, apocryphally as for moral lessons, or as a jurisprudential lens.
Yeah.
For like, what kind of jurisprudence can we take from it? And we're not doing what you're suggesting, which is actually to figure out what is our identity vis-a-vis history and where do we go from here, juxtaposed to everything else that's kind of like being written about us.
And the thing is like an Islamic school of writing history should be comfortable enough to have multiple genres within it. And this is the thing, which is that every time I make this point, um, the ingrained assumptions people have is quite reductive in some ways. It's like is this or that, and I'm saying no. Actually, what I'm asking you here is something totally different, and this is why so much of the book initially is just trying to center the argument on Allah first. Say, look, I'm actually trying to reconstruct you a little bit here in terms of before we start this exercise, so that you understand that actually what I'm asking from you is something totally different.
Yeah,
Um, and then from there we can go forward. And what I'm asking by the end of the book is that I want Muslims to have their own imaginations, right?
yeah,
And those imaginations to be indigenous. And when I talk about Muslims, what's interesting is, can you talk about the Muslim experience without talking about Allah? Which is strange because in the West, we've internalized this idea of Muslim identity simply being an identity of being minorities in the West. And yet, if I made the case to someone that this book is not only about dealing with someone in London who's growing up in Tower Hamlets, this book could be read by somebody in Damascus. The idea is this book could be read in Kuala Lumpur, and this book could be read in, I don't know, Sao Paulo by a non-Muslim, perhaps. The idea is that I'm making a particular case about that fundamentally we've been put in this dunya to worship Allah Ta'ala, and that there are particular frameworks from our tradition that we could use to help us understand that better. And there's different types of writing history. So this is why I said the Islamic perspective, the Iman perspective, and the Ihsan orientated perspective.
yeah,
We can write histories of Muslims in Britain, and we can do an analytical way of writing that history. And I don't think that contradicts Islam whatsoever. And then we can write a history of a biography of a great Muslim scholar who went through trials and tribulations. And at the end of it, we read it and it boosts our Iman. And then we can write a form of history in which we're trying to see patterns and paradigms over a long durée. And that is a contemplative work, and that can be ihsan. And
mm,
I think that they're all possible.
yeah, yeah. I think the trouble is correct me if you think I'm wrong here. I think the trouble is kind of the lack of appreciating for Muslims who are not trained or understand historiography, is that actually every historiography or every school of history um, writes towards a theory, right? So
Yep.
stadial theory, to have some sort of progress, and everything progresses towards something, or communism or whatever it is, it progresses towards something. And I think you're right. I think it's so when you say it, it's so simple that actually our focus is Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. That's the golden era for us, and
Yep.
everything we write, it should write orientated towards that. We
Yep.
don't write, that where I think we do have the assumption, although supposedly have this kind of neutral secular space, the assumption is that everything is progressing and continues to progress. That's the underlying assumption, as well
Yeah,
as other kind of ontological and epistemological kind of things. But I think you can't. Well, I think you're right. We can't reorientate ourselves to the Rasulullah Sallallahu
absolutely.
Alaihi Wasallam.
Absolutely. And this is one of the points I make in the book, which is I want to move from what I call straight line thinking, right? This idea that we're on this, that history is a straight line, that we're on this line of progress, that we really don't have any say of imagining multiple futures. And the past is a faraway place, and we're just living in a continual present. And I'm saying, well, actually, from the rules of the cosmos to the way that we write about the human experience, to the way that we understand how Allah Ta'ala speaks about time and the cosmos, that it's not actually linear at all. It's it's far more cyclical in any shape or form, and everything in the cosmos points to that. So
Yeah,
the fact that we've become so dislocated from understanding reality, and then this is the whole point, that writing history is about writing about the reality of human beings. And if our understanding of reality is skewed by theories and ideology and is not in conformity with reality in the sense that Allah Ta'ala is the only reality, and in that sense, then when we write our histories, we'll be writing them in ways which will not be reflective of what it is that we require in terms of understanding our place in this dunya and the akhirah. Do you know what I mean?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. Yeah, it's so interesting when you. Yeah, again, the whole concept of time in itself,
Yeah,
isn't it? It's
absolutely. And I
yeah,
make this point that, the way that we understand time, and I've said before, in the Ottoman Empire, when clocks came into the Ottoman Empire, they moved away from the cosmos telling you the time to this mechanism telling you the time. And that's interesting because the cosmos was never wrong when it told the time. It sounds bizarre what I'm saying, but you knew what time Salat al Asr was. But if you got a watch now, the watch could freeze, or you could mistune your watch, and it can tell you the wrong time, and it can be quite disruptive. But anyway, the clock, what it did is not only did it change the way we told the time, it changed our perception of time. The Industrial Revolution brought in this idea that now we have to start work at 9 and finish at 5. And I remember I had a student who said to me that you can't pray Salat al Isha after 12 o'clock at night. I said, why not? He said, it's a new day. I said, wait, that's a contemporary understanding of time. That's not how Islam understands time. And when we see that even the times of Salah, that the time that Allah Ta'ala has given us is a lot more porous and malleable in many ways, it's not as rigid. That now today when people are using calculations to see when Ramadan is, or using calculations for the exact time in which Salah starts or when they should break their fast, it kind of goes against the sort of like ethos, or of how time operates in the Islamic tradition. And so going forward now, we don't even have a clock that's a time anymore, because even those clocks used to be cyclical. We now have a digital clock, and that what that does is that's atomized time, and it's made it linear in our brain. So everything is moving in that direction, right? From the tech that we use to the imaginations of how we imagine the future to the way that we tell time. And I think this is concerning for me. Why? Because then Muslims can't understand what moment they're in when things are happening. Like I call it this current period an acceleration moment. Because Allah Ta'ala is the accelerator. Allah Ta'ala brings things forward. That's one of his names, right? And so how do we understand this? Well, you can have a sell by date on a carton of milk and say today is, but what in reality the milk could be fine on day one, it could be okay on day two, and then rapidly decline on day three, even though the sell by date is still there. We can see that in the human disposition. My father is aging rapidly. His aging is accelerating, and so Allah Ta'ala in the time of the cosmos continuously shows us moments of acceleration, from the elongation of the night in the winter to the elongation of the day in the summer. And if you understand that, then you understand that the human experience, there are moments in the lived collective human experience where acceleration happens too, where time starts to feel like things are moving very quickly, like World War One and World War Two. Those are exceptional acceleration moments, where all things turn on their head. And as historians, I guess the point I'm making is that once we understand the names of Allah Ta'ala and we understand that Allah Ta'ala curated the cosmos, and that the insan is not in contradiction to all the rules in the cosmos, in the sense that we all submit to Allah Ta'ala, apart from the fact that Allah gave insan free will, which nothing else in the cosmos has, perhaps. Then what you see then is that we start to understand the lived human experience and its complexities. It could be written in a different way. It could be written in a way which is not linear, periodical, and time stamped like that. It could be a series of cycles and a series of multiples, and so forth. So I think what I'm proposing right now is I would like to see a more complicated way of writing history. And I'll just finish this last point. So I was thinking one time of writing like a story of 5 individuals, and each chapter was the life of a particular individual, and in the middle chapter was the event where we see what happens to these 5 individuals. And then chapter 7, 8, 9, 10, once again, is these individual chapters of what happened to these people. So it's 5, and then it goes into 1. And just to experiment and just to disrupt the way we see linear history writing. And these are the things I think that Muslims should think about, that history doesn't have to be written A, B, C, D, and E, which is how it's been presented by some of these YouTubers, unfortunately, right? And I'm not too keen on that.
Yeah, this is I don't but maybe probably people do actually understand maybe how excuse me, how kind of radical this is in terms of writing history, because history, as we're taught in undergrad, masters, whatever, is you dimension it into eras and epochs and so on and so forth, right?
Right, absolutely.
You have your common values and
Right,
technology, the modern era, pre-modern, Tudors, as we mentioned
yeah,
earlier on, and so on. And this is a completely different way of thinking about it. It's completely different.
yeah,
You don't dimension it as eras. You have cycles.
yeah, absolutely.
Complete relationship with the cosmos, completely different relationship with time,
Right,
cause and effect. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about. I think I mentioned to you actually about how much more would we appreciate the coming of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam if we understood the 200, 300 years prior. And I think I mentioned this to you about kind of
yeah,
like
you did.
teaching the seerah from the Justinian plague, which was about, I
Yeah,
think, 200 years prior to the coming of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam,
yeah,
which is so amazing in its kind of like logistics in what it does to the world, the
yeah,
power shifts. I won't go into too many details, but it's like the Justinian plague lasts a couple hundred years. It destroys the Byzantine Empire at the time when it's looking like they're going to unite. It completely just collapses them, completely collapses the infrastructure. I mean, in this plague in the last couple of hundred years, so that when Rasulullah Sallam comes, they're effectively very weak,
yeah.
and that gives a fertile soil for the message. You think about that, you think, wow, look, this is Allah Subhanahu wa Taala doing this.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is one of the interesting things about I wrote in the book, that history written like that, it gives you the understanding of the qadr of Allah Ta'ala and the qudr
Mm,
of Allah Ta'ala. You
yeah,
understand? So like, I'll give you an example of the Mongol invasion. People often talk about the defeat of the Mongols or the Jalut and so forth. But the Mongols were also defeated at Nagasaki. So, which is intriguing, that the Mongols were defeated in Japan and in the Muslim world simultaneously, or roughly in the same time stamp period.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and there was a Mongol overstretch. Yes, the Mongols become Muslim in the Islamic world, but in the Far East they become Buddhists. And that, if we start to see it from this perspective, we don't have that. We can have a different understanding of what was happening to the Mongol world, and sort of like understanding, how things were changing. And I do believe, because people ask me again, like, well, wouldn't have this been done before? And I'm saying, well, no, because as we, different thinkers, we should believe that we are people who are capable of bringing new things to the table. And why not? And the access of information we have today, the
yeah.
amount of information we have today, and the speed in which we can attain information means we can be a lot more ambitious in writing these global histories, in ways that historians wouldn't have had been able to do in the past. And that
Mm.
is something we can put onto the table.
And I think it does open up. So I don't keep coming back to this, but I think it's so important. It opens up the subjectivity that you talk about, right? It allows different epistemological perspectives
Yep,
and ways of writing history. I think
absolutely.
again, I think I mentioned to you the other day, in terms of like how we remember time in Pakistan is not the same as how we remember it here. It's
No,
not a date. It's when so and so did a shadi, or when such
yeah,
such event.
my mum is like that. My mum always says to me, "I remember, when my cousin was born on this day. That's the day we went and did such and such."
Right, right,
Or forget even that. Like even like in Ramadan, when we were kids, my mum used to say to us, she says it to us even now, "Come home before it gets dark." She doesn't say a time.
yeah,
She says when it gets dark. They were
yeah,
far more in touch with this natural way of engaging with time.
yeah, yeah. And I think this is one of the challenges I had, because you try and introduce some of these sources. And the reason I mentioned like Richard Drayton in the beginning actually was, I know you're talking about kind of having Allah and having a not necessarily a language, but talking about our experience. And it's so interesting to me, that in London, if you go to particular communities that are non-Muslim, like West Africa, West Indies, and so on, that kind of culture, they have adopted some of our language as Muslims. So they say,
Yeah.
"Inshallah, alhamdulillah."
Yeah,
It's
I saw a kid the other day going, "Wallahi," and that kid was not Muslim,
yeah,
and
yeah,
I couldn't believe it. I was just laughing, going, "What?"
exactly, right. And but it's so common. It's so common in London. I don't know if you got the same thing in Oz
Bro,
Tanzil.
honestly, this is a true story. 3 days ago, I was at a bus stop. There was a white guy with a dog. He came past me, went, "Salaam alaikum, brother." I went, "Oh, alaikum salam."
Yeah, yeah.
Then I saw him again, and I said, "By the way, are you Muslim?" He went, "No." I was like, "Oh, okay." Then that's where we're at. That's where we're at.
So it's so interesting culturally that's
Yeah,
where we're at, and yet we're still so afraid to speak about use these terms
yeah.
in our kind of like what we I guess perceive as objective academic, highfalutin discourse, when it's so common. It's so common. I think
It's interesting for me as well because one of the first person who bought my book, the first person was an American woman, and she wasn't Muslim,
oh,
and
really,
she walked past the stand that we were at in Frankfurt, and she was so kind, and she comes up and she goes, this. She flicks through and she goes, "This looks interesting. I'm studying Arabic." And I said, "Oh wow!" And she goes, I'd like to read this." And the first book I signed was for her, and she was happy to engage with it. And I'd explained to her what the book was about, and she goes, "Yeah, I'd like to read that." And there is an assumption somehow that we feel that people don't want to know about our culture. But post Gaza, people are becoming Muslim anyway. And I
right,
always feel that, the idea is okay, if people don't want to become Muslim, that's fine. That's not but they can still engage with Islamic works and appreciate it.
yeah,
They can still engage with what we're producing. We live in a globalized world. I mean, how is it that I am trained to appreciate watching Star Wars and the opposite can't happen? Like,
right,
what is going on here? That doesn't make sense to me. When I was a kid, like growing up in Britain, so many of the TV shows and so forth were Christian orientated, and I watched them and I engaged with them, and that's what it was.
yeah.
I think people are capable of and willing to and want to engage with what I would say Islamic text written in its own, um, language, and they're happy to engage with it in the way they see fit.
I think so. I think you're right. But how do we kind of maybe the answer is obvious anyway, but I'll ask it anyhow. How do we kind of then prevent the orientalization of that? Because that's exactly what they did, to an extent, right? They went and took these texts back and translated them from
I don't.
Arabic, French,
Yeah,
whatever.
I don't think there's much we can do there. People are going to do what they want to do, right? In the end of the day, but what we have to be is as authentic to our writing experiences as we can be. Um, yeah, how do you that's something that it's a good question because even I need to think about how would you circumvent that, and I'm not sure like today right now on this podcast I'm not sure how I would work around that. That's something I would need to think about
Yeah,
if
it's just
I need to do it at all.
yeah, yeah. It's just funny 'cause I it was who was it? I can't remember its name now. It will come to me later on. It's in the book called Racisms by, and I can't remember his name now, but he has this really nice kind of like vignette about this Dutch bloke who goes out to India as part of the Dutch East India Company, and he just becomes, like effectively a Brahmin, adopts the mannerisms and the clothing and this sort of stuff, and it's just like, but then he's also living this kind of like dual life of being Dutch, but kind of
Yeah,
like going native, as we might
yeah,
say,
yeah,
and it's just like you're not engaging with the culture on its merits. You're engaging with it as far as kind of as far as you can take some benefit from it.
yeah,
And I think that was kind of one of the failures of multiculturalism as an experiment. It's there to as far as you can profit from it. So if you can profit from
yeah, absolutely.
selling Sajada, but it's interesting actually because that brings well, the Epstein files and this Kiswa thing, right?
Mm.
That's kind of like another form of orientalizing something very very sacred.
Yeah, and you can see the frustration that
Yeah,
Muslims have. I guess the bigger frustration is not that Epstein desired to have this. I mean, people always want to. They always desire to have something that they can't have. It's the way it was willingly given away. And I think there is something to be said there about certain segments in certain parts of the Muslim leadership, perhaps, and so forth, are so freely ready to just to cut chunks out of their tradition and just pass it off
yeah,
as if it's not important. And I think there has to be some sort of response to that because that's just not
yeah,
acceptable.
absolutely. Um, so let's talk about kind of like I think the latter part of the book, which is kind
Hmm.
of you're getting to imagining the future of what history might look like and what we might want to imagine for our future, right?
Hmm.
So I guess my first question on that is, can a community really begin to imagine a future if it kind of uses past either as kind of fantasy or as we kind of mentioned earlier on, kind of moral lessons or jurisprudential lessons, or on the other hand, I think a lot of the times, certainly my generation anyway, is we would talk about our past almost shamefully, right? So 9/11, even pre that, right? It's kind of like, yeah, we're kind of sorry about that. We're sorry about this
Yeah,
kind of thing that happened, and the Ottomans and this sort of thing.
yeah,
So, is it possible for us to imagine
yeah.
when we?
I think it is possible, but we need to get over ourselves a little bit. When I'm dealing with Ottoman history, I've got attacked by people left, right, and center in ways that surprise me sometimes. uh, I get attacked by some people who are anti-Ottoman and thinks I'm some sort of Turkish spy, which is just hilarious. But there are some people who feel that when I'm speaking about Ottoman history, that I should highlight all the negative things that the Ottomans have done, as if somehow that would, um, you know, um, alleviate us from the sins of the Ottomans in terms of what they did. And I'm saying, look, I teach about these complexities in the classroom. We don't have to have that inferiority complex of every time somebody points at things that Muslims did that doesn't sit to your moral standards, that somehow we have to keep apologizing for it. I want to move on from that type of like thinking to some degree and write about history where we own it, both the good and the bad, so that we come to terms with it. And sometimes I'll get people. I had a person the other day say to me, he knew somebody who was a Muslim who in Ramadan eats in the dark because she doesn't want Allah to see her. And I was looking at him saying, "Why is he telling me this information? What do you want me to do with this? Like, what's this got to do with me? Like, what type of feeling do you want me to have regarding this story?
Right.
That's not what I do. That's not
Yeah.
what my interest is, and that's not what I think I want to talk to Muslims about."
Mm,
So I guess what I've come to realize is rather than pandering to the insecurities that exist within certain segments of the Muslim community about our historical past, that I want to write a more mature type of history where we engage with those complexities and we understand them for what they were so that we can be more morally upright in comparison to that. And that we can also understand that we have the capacity to err in that way, just like people before us. And that even if we do err in that way, that in the end of the day, Allah Ta'ala is the most merciful. And that doesn't mean that we still can't imagine for the future to be a better place. and we have to work towards that, irrespective. One of the things I learned from the book, not just about the writing experience, but the experience of the book itself, was when I first finished the book, I felt very deficient as a thinker and as a writer.
Mm.
I looked at it and I said, "Oh man!" Like, because I'm reading works of Iqbal and Attaz and Taha Abdurrahman and these, Mustafa Sabri. These are giants in the way that they write. And I wrote this as a simpleton. I wrote a book, and I felt, you know what? I'm very deficient as a thinker, and yet the book has been doing well. And then I learned that Allah Ta'ala in His Rahmah, He will gloss over your deficiency in many ways. That's irrelevant to Allah. He knows that we're all deficient. And in actuality, every single names that I've mentioned are equally deficient in the eyes of Allah. And it is Allah who elevates thoughts and ideas and uses us as vehicles when He feels like we are worthy to be that. And so then I learned myself that I need to get over my own perfectionism. And I need to get over myself in regards to my own sense of thinking that, producing a work like this won't do well because it's not as polished as something else. Maybe Allah Ta'ala requires something different in regards to the engagement of this book, and that's in His hands, and He can do whatever He sees fit. And so this
Right.
has been an important learning curve for me too, not just simply, and I guess this is the key thing about the book, is that I was not only making the case about how we engage with history, I was also trying to make the case of how do you as a human see yourself. So I'm asking you not only to engage with the discipline, but to really look at yourself internally and re-look at yourself and then say, okay, we have to be a little bit different here, perhaps. And I hope that comes across a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's uh, a really interesting point actually about seeing yourself. How do you see yourself as a human, right? Because I think a lot of the times, almost universally, I think in history and writing history, in particular point of viewpoint, be it
Mm.
Whig or Marxist or whatever, there is a particular definition of human, right? It's in
Yeah.
the subtext, but it's there, and therefore everything outside of that is unhuman. Actually, I think you mentioned that maybe in parts of the book, what it means to be human.
And I think that's important because, you know, um, I have learned that in the academy when I was in it, there's an exceptional level of hubris.
Yeah,
And in fact, when you look at the field as a whole, it's a field dependent. It's a field that's very ignorant.
yeah,
So it's it's
yeah,
it's bizarre for me that the level of hubris that's masking over this mass level of ignorance is crazy. And so I'm asking then people that we can't, we shouldn't be like that when we're reading about people of the past. That there has to be a level of decorum that I've seen more recently that's been missing in Muslims. They talk
mm,
about people in the past in such flippant manners, as if it's okay to do that. It's not okay to do that, actually. I was at a workshop once in Germany in which an academic said, the great thing about history writing is the people are dead, so we can kind of do what we want. And it was a throwaway comment, but it irked me. So I said, no, actually, in accordance to my tradition, we will be held accountable for what we say about the people of the past. And
yeah,
that, in actuality, further consolidates the need for us to be truthful in the way that we curate our subjective narratives about these people. And this is why we used to write, and Allah knows best. And so it
yeah,
goes to the Muslim is not simply a person who's trying to endeavor and trying to um, write the truth and so forth. They fundamentally are truth seeker, right?
yeah.
And that's important to me.
Yeah. It's I'm just as you said that, I was thinking actually that's how we would write history. It's you'd mention someone from the past and you would say, "Man, have mercy on them,"
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah,
And that is something that you would, as a Muslim, you would do that. But why
yeah,
wouldn't you do that
absolutely.
as a historian if you're writing that as a
Yeah,
historian?
yeah.
Uh,
I remember Jevdet Pasha. He wrote in his Tarihi Jevdet about
mm,
Alim Dar Mustafa Bayraktar. He was a according to Jevdet, he was a genius of a um, iron magnet. But he the way that he dies is he gets surrounded by the Janissaries. It's an interesting story. His house gets surrounded by the Janissaries, he's the Grand Vizier, and he blows up his own house with gunpowder and dynamite, killing 20,000 Janissary soldiers with him. And then Jevdet writes, if only he was still alive, but only Allah knows why he was taken away from us. So on the one hand, he saw a person who was a genius, and if he was still around, he probably would have changed the fortunes of the Ottoman world. But he died, and only Allah knows why he died. And Jevdet said, I don't know why he died, but Allah knows best, right? And that's a very interesting way of engaging with history, in that sense, of recognizing that some things won't make sense to us, but Allah Ta'ala in His wisdom knows better than us. And that moment that's happened in someone's life, the repercussions of it may not be immediate. There might be repercussions that as a result of that could be 50 years to 60 to 70 years later. And that's the unique thing about what you and I do. And I really do hope that you pursue history writing, even as a hobby, because we are macroscopic, and I write this in, but we are macroscopic and microscopic. We can look at the big picture and we can look at the small picture. And that's a unique thing as a human being, to be able to look at the world in that way, to look at the bigger picture at times, and kind of go macro out and see all these various pieces, and then kind of go back in and look narrower. So alhamdulillah.
Yeah. So from that macro point, actually, I think it ties in. Do you find, I mean, as an Ottoman historian,
Mhm.
my kind of focus was on, well, it's mostly on post-partition Pakistan, India, but the subcontinent. Now, I can see the link between Ottoman and Mughal history. There's a very, very clear link. The Ottomans sent generals to help Babur. It's a very clear link, and we can construct a story around that. So we can, and then even in partition, right? We can construct a story around, excuse me, or the Khilafat movement, and how Muslims from India sent their gold
Absolutely.
and so on. Now it's a bit more tricky. I think, or it was become tricky. Maybe not more tricky. It's become tricky to construct a story around someone in Pakistan and someone in Nigeria. There's no kind of clear link, right? How do you think we can get around that? Is there a way around that and that incorporates the global Muslim Ummah?
Well, I think the links have to be there. But one of the things that I've learned, so even now, if we were to write contemporary history about today, one of the things that I always point to is to find the sort of like synergy and commonalities, right? There is a particular type of zeitgeist existing in the Muslim world, not only in the Muslim world, in the Ummah itself. And I'll say this regarding post Gaza, which is that you can see everywhere I've been around the world, I kind of hear the same type of argumentation by Muslims, and the same type of concerns, same type of fears, which indicates to me that by and large, even though we are very different from each other and our politics might be different and so forth, one, there is still a residue that's been left behind in which we all kind of take from. And then two, it's really interesting to see, because I'm an intellectual historian. So one of the things I write when I'm writing about the late Ottoman Empire is there's these ideas that came about in Istanbul, and then I saw them in Yemen. Now I don't know how they got to Yemen. I just don't know how they got there. There's no trace to find that, but they were there. And then some of those ideas were found in the Balkans. So
Mm.
how has this happened, right? And so maybe when we're doing intellectual conceptual history, we can find better ways of showing that ideas are a lot more fluid, that cross borders and so forth, and can facilitate commonalities, um, and so on. And right now, when I look at Gaza, if I was to write the history of today's Gaza in 50 years' time, it'd be very interesting to see how the catalyst of that became, from the amplification of the Epstein files, to the pressure on the Iranians, to the Hezbollah leaving Syria, to the Syrians gaining power, to the shift that did between Turkey, Saudi, and Pakistan. There's all these chain events that have taken place because of that. And that would be a very interesting form of history writing, where you could include the things that are happening in America regarding the culture wars and MAGA, to what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, to what's happened to the Europeans. It just requires, once again, going back, that the historian requires an imagination and an ability to understand these things, and
Yeah.
then be able to put the pieces together. And we're not saying imagination for imagination's sake. It's having that capacity to see those bigger pictures and say, oh, okay, you know what? This is what's going on here in accordance to me.
Yeah, you just reminded me of something I read. It was so I can't. It was a primary source, and I can't remember what it was now. But there was a thing about Hajj, and I was looking into Hajj specifically because I was doing some research on the Khilafat movement, and they had this idea that we need to preserve the Ottoman Caliphate because
Mm,
the Caliph is the one who is effectively facilitating the Hajj. Although at the
yeah.
time, if I remember correctly, at the time actually he wasn't administrating it. It was the Thomas Cook Company,
Hmm.
uh, now called TUI or something, aren't they? Holiday
Yeah.
maker. Anyway, so I was looking into something, and there was this thing about how people who couldn't afford to go the full Hajj would travel to like the next city, find a
Yeah.
person going to the next city,
Yeah.
give them a letter or give them a seal or something, and it's like that's actually to
Yeah.
look at the interconnectedness of the Ummah in that way,
Well,
spatially
you
and
know what's
relatively.
amazing, bro, is that this is really understudied in the field of Ottoman studies. There are
Yeah,
a number of people from the Asia subcontinent who went to the Ottoman Empire during the Hajj and never returned back, and then
right,
just smelted into Ottoman society and life. And the Ottomans didn't kick them out. And this is known in the Hamidi period, for example, that Sultan Abdul Hamid during the Hajj seasons would have many tents built in the Hijaz for Muslims from India who wouldn't want to return, and things like this. And they just became amalgamated into those societies. And today, if we did a DNA test, I wouldn't be surprised if people in Saudi Arabia had been
yeah,
coming from India. It just
yeah,
wouldn't surprise me at all, you know.
yeah. I can see
Um,
that. See that.
Yeah, just like in Malaysia, when you go to Malaysia and they have a huge respect for the Hadrami Malay, they call them the Hadrami Malay, who were people who initially came from Yemen. They are now part of the Malay sort of like peoples, but they recognize that these were Sayyids that came from Yemen and brought Islam there. And there's a lot of this type of movement that we don't appreciate, that has always been happening throughout human history.
Sorry, I was muting myself. So do you think so? It's really interesting because I think there's so many communities like that across the globe, right? I think in Pakistan now there's a fairly sizable what they call Shiddi community.
Mhm.
Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah, which
Yeah,
comes
in Karachi, yeah.
yeah in Karachi, and people might not know that they played an integral part in some of the Mughal Empire as well,
Yeah, yeah.
or the Mughal naval fleet. Um, So, do you think, as Muslims stepping away now from kind of like Western schools of history to our own kind of
Yeah.
where we are, do you think there's a problem with Muslims in kind of identifying our own minorities within our cultures and letting them speak about history?
That's an interesting question because when I was in the US, I was asked about how can they write their histories. Now, one of
Yeah,
the things I've mentioned to them is that you should write about your history in real time right now. And that the next generation should know, for example, the sort of like challenges you went through to get here so that they sort of understand what it
mm,
means. But I also said, but many of you from various communities and various backgrounds, and you should write those histories too. Because in the
right.
Quran, Allah Ta'ala says that I've made you different cultures and peoples so that you may know one another. So
Yeah,
if I'm sitting here right now and the brother next to me is from Burkina Faso, I would love to read the history that he has to offer me. Like if he told me that this was what Islam was like in Burkina Faso, this is how I came to America, this is what happened to us. If we start to produce works like that within our own cultural context, but for the Ummah by and large will become far more informed about each other. And I think that is needed, and that can happen. And I would encourage that type of history writing more and more because I love now reading personally. I just love reading history works in general about all sorts of people. I mean, I'm reading about Japan right now and China. I'm just intrigued, and I'm working with a friend, Naoki Yamamoto, and we're working on a project about in the 19th early 20th century during World War II, there was a group of Japanese generals who converted to Islam. They're known as fake Muslims in Japanese historiography, and they were actually spies that the Japanese told to become Muslim, so that they could have some sort of leverage over the Silk Road, and so on,
Right.
because they had colonized Manchuria and whatnot. But what was interesting here is that some of these guys went on the Hajj, or some of these guys learned, English from the ulama in India, and some of them, people believe in Japan, at least the Muslims at least believe that they actually, by the end of it, believed in Islam, but there was no infrastructure for them, so they went by the wayside. Now, most Japanese academics reject that. They will say no, they were actually fake Muslims. But that sort of like um, learning of history in Japan is interesting, because the average Japanese person doesn't even know of this. They're
Right.
oblivious to it, right?
Yeah.
And so this is where history can be informative in so many different ways, because at the moment in Japan, for example, the government, which is right leaning, there are some people that assume that Islam has had no presence in Japan, and that this contemporary presence in Islam in Japan is disruptive. But if Muslims in Japan could show that, look, Muslims have been around in Japan for a while, like for example, when the bomb was dropped in um, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when you go to the graveyard, there are Muslim graves there. There
Oh,
were
wow.
Muslim students who were studying in Japan at the time for
Yeah.
various reasons. There are Muslims who had left China because of the struggles, and Muslims who'd gone from Malaysia there, and they passed away. When you look at the early Dutch trade in Nagasaki, they say there's only Nagasaki was mainly Christian. But when you look at the paintings, the Dutch had brought Malay Muslims over to engage with the Japanese. So there's various ways of writing about Islam's presence and Muslim presence in various communities, and I think this would be fascinating for us to write. So for me, I'm surprised because there's so much we could write about, so much, and yet we are engaging in very narrow works and so on.
That's yeah. Just yeah. There's such a breadth of our experience. I think as Muslims,
Yeah,
all over the place. I think we've been everywhere,
yeah,
all
yeah, yeah,
over the place. Uh,
absolutely.
and I think it goes to your point about kind of imagining futures. Is what you can when you understand kind of all of this. So one of my frustrations today with our contemporary kind of politics and our contemporary kind of like way we view ourselves is I think we're very situated in the West and we're very kind of beholden to our place in the West, and we're like, we need to. But I think there are so many other ways of doing things. And one of the examples I tend to give is the Nana Asma'u and her associates at the Yantaru, the associates as they were called, and they're kind of like didactic resistance, oral didactic resistance to kind of firstly losing their Islamic culture and their Islamic education, and secondly to the British Empire. And they did this completely kind of orally, completely kind of outside of any infrastructure. So I think I'm anticipating the question, well, how do you plan to do this, Dr. Yakoob, without institutional support? Did you plan to get your book into like kind of undergrad library and the libraries? But I think the point is that there are so many other ways of doing things. You don't
100%.
you don't need this.
100%. So look, one of the reasons why I had a focus on the book, continuously writing about Ummah, is because to some degree I wanted to explode out that we're not just these, Muslims living in London. Then in actuality, because
Mm,
I was in America at the time asking some young students about the idea of what does it mean to belong to the Ummah, and they said Palestine, Rohingyas, Uyghurs, and it was like Muslims who are being oppressed. That was the mindset, that when they think of
right.
the term Ummah, they don't think of this large body of Muslims. What they think of is oppressed people. That's the only time we use it. And then I said, what about the Ummah of the past? And they went, oh yeah. And I said, and what about the Ummah of the future that hasn't come? And what I was trying to do was kind of bleed out their narrow understanding and sort of just make it wider, that goes beyond time and space. And once you go beyond time and space, then that's when I started to appreciate and realize that this is a better way of understanding what it means to belong to Ummah, and it deconstructs the sort of like nation state narrative of making us very narrow people. Now, don't get me wrong, I think local histories are important. I think cultural history writing is important, and I think we need to have those works. But the point I'm making, I guess, is the idea that I wanted to just deconstruct, ourselves in the West a little bit by thinking we are the center of the universe, because we just are not. And when you learn about different Muslims in different parts of the world, that really helps.
Yeah, absolutely. I really think we need to focus a lot more on this. Focus a lot more on kind of this kind of centered in the West, and then this kind of it's a weird kind of like imagined history of the Ottomans and the Mughals, perhaps
Yep.
maybe the Abbasids and the Umayyads, maybe, but it's kind of
Yep.
like um, I've had people coming up to me in the past or questions about we have a Khalif, a Khalifa from the time of Rasulullah. You're like, no, that's not necessarily true. In fact, maybe you could argue reasonably that the history of Islam is a history of communities, and yes, there was a political power within that. But when you go back to the really early sources like Tirmidhi, there's it's so often mentioned that there was a community of people that came and gave Rasulullah shahada, and then they went off, and you never hear of them again, or at least not in the primary sources. Maybe they came back, but they went off. Some of the earliest masajids were built outside of the
Yeah.
Hijaz, and it's communities just going about and just being communities, and kind of like living
Those
Islam.
stories are amazing. Those stories are really fascinating, because I've traveled around the world and I've turned up to places and I've gone, oh, there's a mosque in Poland.
Right.
What's
How
this
do they
mosque about? And they'll say, this mosque has existed since the time of the Ottomans. And you go,
Yeah.
what? And these sort of things are fascinating, because they actually, once again, they deconstruct our very narrow understanding of our place in this world. They explain to us a lot more about not just this ummah, but just identity and belonging, and how to engage with each other and how to be better informed. And then
Mm,
even in terms of our activism, it changes things, because in our activism is not just simply restricted to one form over another, but we start to become a lot better informed. I mean, a lot of people get surprised when I travel around the world. I've learned that when you travel around the world, the two things that warm people up to you the closest is, okay, one, if you can speak the language, but I'll put that to the side. If you know about their culture and you know about their history,
mm,
straight away they get blown out of the water. That you know about that? Said, yeah, I was reading about that actually, because it means that you're trying to learn about them. And I said this in the book as well. You can't even. How can you do political, understand politics, if you don't understand the history of those peoples that you're doing politics about? Right.
right. Right. So, I guess for you, what
Mhm.
kind of what would be the ideal kind of Muslim created from the kind of historical consciousness that you're talking about? How would that look?
At the moment, I don't know what that would look like, to be honest, and I'll be pretty frank. But that's the conversation I'm trying to have in the book,
Yeah.
which is, the
Yeah.
book is an intervention in some ways. It's a conversation starter. It's a call, by saying, look, I've been in this field for this long. This is what I've noticed. This is what I've observed. This is what I've engaged with. I haven't crystallized many things, but these things are not working. And will you engage with me on this? And will you be willing to say, yeah, you're right, and and so forth. I like, for example, some people found it quite surprising when I said that history should be part of the ulum ala, just like kalam or mantiq or whatnot. But I do believe in today's day and age that not having history, comprehensive learning history, not just dates and figures, but the way that we've spoken about, you and I today, as an intellectual sort of
Mm,
like discipline, I think not having that is to the detriment of the scholar in many ways, and it can be far more enhancing for the scholar if history is taught to them, because new conditions, new realities bring to the table new possibilities of providing solutions from Islam. That is important for me, and then you don't get very lazy and sloppy fatwas, devoid of any historical context. And I think this is what I want to propose, perhaps. And then I'm willing to engage with Muslims like yourselves who are in the field, to say, this is what I was thinking,
mm,
and these are the ideas that come to my mind. And I see what you're saying here in the book. I'm not sure if that will work, but have you thought about that? And I'll be saying, okay, great, because that's the whole point of what I was saying about an Islamic, framework of writing history is an inclusion of multiple Muslim writers who all bring something to the table, so that we start to curate a large corpus of knowledge production. Because fundamentally, my concern is that we have not only become great consumers of information, but we are also being consumed. And yet,
Right.
that's not what I want. I want to see knowledge production, and my field is history, and so I'm engaging in that. But I'm more than happy for people to engage in other forms of knowledge production, so long as that happens, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, there is a problem. I think, I think you've rightly identified in the book of knowledge production, not necessarily not in the book necessarily, but knowledge production kind of being devoid of God consciousness and being around Allah and around that kind of community. So, yeah, just as you were saying that, I was thinking actually you're right. It can be applied wider. It can be much wider.
Yeah,
But it's an interesting point you made about writing history and the kind of us writing history. And I was thinking actually, uh, as someone who studies the Mughals, or has studied the Mughals, I always get the question about William Dalrymple.
yeah.
And I'm like, I don't like the guy. And I'll say very honestly and very frankly. And I think one of the reasons that I like him is because not only is he not Muslim, and he's talking about kind of a Muslim history in a way that actually is very, very descended from Islam. Yeah, right.
Hmm.
It's almost kind of like an apologetics of colonialism, if you like.
Yeah, yeah,
But he doesn't know the languages
yeah.
either. He doesn't know Urdu. He can't speak
Right.
it. He for his book. I know for a fact for his book on Badr Shah Zafar, he used a translator for Urdu. And I
Right.
remember looking at one of his translations. I tracked down the newspaper that he was using
Hmm.
from his primary sources, and I read the Urdu for myself. And I was like, the translation you've used is absolutely atrocious.
Right.
And the translation he used was from a headline of an article saying um, "Hamare hum watano, hamare hum watano," right? And he's translated that as saying it's a call to specifically only Muslims. But any
Hmm.
native Urdu speaker
Yeah,
would
yeah.
disagree with
No,
that.
yeah, that's right. That's right.
Because it doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't say that for just Muslims. That's
Yeah,
for all your people.
right. That's right.
Um, so what was my point? I think my point was, yeah, it's that frustration of relying on academics. I mean, maybe it's partly kind of our what's the word I'm looking for? Our own kind of oh god, what's the word? It's on the tip
Oh,
of my
look,
tongue.
just to, the frustration also exists in the community. The number of people in the communities who say to me, and they're aware of certain things about how the academy has written about them, and they'll say, Are there any books for my children? Are there
Yeah.
any books I can use for? What can I read? What can you tell me I can read?" And so forth. And then I have to tell them, I said, unfortunately, we're navigating this at the moment because we are not doing it. Well, we're not doing it to a level which can provide your needs, to teach your
Mm,
children, and for you to be informed. And so, and the thing is it's a lucrative business for some people, in terms of that sort of like history writing. But for us, for me, it's more than that. It's this is why I said it's something related to my iman and something related to ilm itself, because ilm is part of iman. And this is why I'm encouraging, I'm hoping, really, I'm just hoping that when I was at SOAS doing my master's, I was the only non-Turkish Muslim in my master's class doing Ottoman studies.
oh wow.
And then I remember when I was doing my PhD, I was still the only non-Turk Muslim doing a PhD in Ottoman studies. And there was a joke at SOAS flying around at the time because I was the only one doing it. And when I went to Turkey, I remember at my first conference, someone came to me and goes, "Why don't you study Pakistani history? Why are you studying Ottoman history?"
Mm.
I looked at them and said, "You wouldn't say that to John Smith. Why have you said that to me?" And and since then, I have seen Muslims go into the academic field and do history, but very few of them come down into the communities. Very few of them have done work for the communities. And the question you asked previously about how how can I survive beyond the academy and so forth. The internet has changed everything.
Mm,
We can get information out there in all sorts of forms, whether it's Substack, to YouTube, to self-publishing, to finding Muslim publishers, to whatnot. So there are avenues we can use where we don't have to be restricted within the academic spaces, which has become very um, sort of like careerist driven. And
yeah,
also, I'm looking forward to curating these third spaces. To be honest with you, like the
yeah,
book that I wrote, um, we used a Turkish publisher because I wanted to support them, and the Turkish publishers gave me a lot more leeway in being able to sell this book. And there were some people saying, "Well, this is not a famous publisher." And saying, "But this is how it starts. This is how it begins." And then gradually, we will start to see more works written by more Muslims and so forth. And since I've published the book, what I've also noticed, alhamdulillah, is that other Muslim writers have now got the confidence to say, you know what, there are other avenues for us to write. And I've met many who want to write now. And that can't be a bad thing. That's a great thing.
for sure. Yeah, I think it's yeah, one of my frustrations at King's was I actually wanted to set up a journal there that was, and you know how the journal space is, the for-profit journal space, very
Yeah,
kind of like, and I wanted to set up a journal that was kind of the opposite of what the traditional journal space is. So it would include fiction, stories,
yeah,
poetry. It would include non-English submissions, right?
right.
Which I didn't require. I didn't want to have a translation for. It would be there as it is, right? If you could read it, read it. If not, then kind of that's your problem. Um, to kind of to kind of make that point about we can do things beyond the academy. We can do things that are non-conventional, but are still knowledge production.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, it didn't work out for various reasons. But I think it's encouraging. I think it's really encouraging to hear that actually that people are now thinking about doing
yeah,
things in that
yeah,
way outside of the academy, writing books, taking control of. Because I think it comes back to my question at the beginning, like how was what was your experience? And I think being someone, I think maybe there's more Muslim historians now, Muslims taking up history, but there weren't many.
no.
Uh, I mean, I think I was the only one in my class in undergrad.
And I've spoken to so many Muslim academics themselves who sort of appreciate what I'm vocalizing.
Yeah,
And I get it as well that even in our communities, STEM is the way to go forward, right? This
yeah,
is what people think. But we need thinkers. The intellectual sort of like our dean is a dean that's that's built on an intellectual legacy. And we should be people who also can offer something. I was speaking to a friend only today, and the idea of just that our knowledge production is just fiqh and
right.
hadith and Quran and Sharia. Our tradition is logic, it's mathematics, it's geography, it's fiction, it's poetry, it's literature, it's history. And that's what we want to see, right? That's what we want. We want that wholesome sort of like comprehensive culture of knowledge production because society needs it, people need it.
Yeah, and I like the point you made about the it perhaps being one of the ulum al ala.
Yeah,
I think in many ways it already is, just not in the way maybe we think about it as
yeah,
historians. But I mean, any sheikh worth their salt will be able to kind of like, here's the sanad of this hadith. I can tell you the whole
yeah,
thing. Here it
that's
is.
right.
Here's the riwayah of this, and so on and so forth. So they do history in
Yeah,
a sense, like
absolutely.
evaluating evidences in a sense. Um, it would be great to formalize actual kind of historic
Yeah.
kind of a version of that. Of have history classes.
Yeah,
I
absolutely, and it'd be amazing in that to take off, because I've said like that sometimes it feels to me that history feels like some sort of like just additional vocation, some sort of optional subject you can pick, and it can be so much more than that, and really amplify the sort of like experience of thinkers
Mm,
once they get that whole grounding of gaining that historical consciousness.
absolutely right. Right, I'm not going to keep you too much longer.
No
Maybe we'll
worries.
finish with a couple of questions. So I think this is the question. I think we kind of already covered it anyway, but I'll ask it for kind of just to summarize. So, what do you hope we can achieve as a Muslim community from kind of the back of the book and what you discussed in here and kind of the imagined futures? What is your hope?
Well, firstly, on a very basic level, I want us to think of ourselves differently than the way that we are right now. We are not victims. We are part of a proud tradition, and we have existed, you know, from the time of Adam alayhi salam as people who have worshipped Allah Ta'ala, and we are people that believe in that. And Islam is going to be here until the end of time. And Islam doesn't need us. Allah doesn't need us. We need it. So we should really stand up and be counted and try to show Allah Ta'ala that we are worthy, of Him to enter Jannah. And what that means then is that for me is to start to resuscitate um, our forms of knowledge production that can once again elevate us in our communities and then become a beacon that can elevate humanity, that can
Mm.
show that we have something important to offer in many ways. I say this in every platform I'm on now. Now's the time to be Muslim, right?
Mm.
It's easy to be Muslim when things are great, but actually, you the time to be Muslim is when really it's difficult because we spoke about Salahuddin, but you don't get a Salahuddin Ayyubi moment if post Crusaders there weren't
Right.
Muslims who stood up to be counted for. They could have
Mm.
abandoned Islam and given it up. They could have given it up during the Mongol invasions. They could have given it up in many moments, but they didn't. And so for us, that's what's important to do. And so I want to see more people now engaging in this vocation, perhaps, and feel proud that they're Muslim and that um, put themselves forward in their capacity as Muslims, not as people who feel that they are inferior, but be positive about what they have to offer because fundamentally they have Allah on their side. And then Allah Ta'ala gave them His Quran as a rahmah, and He gave us His Prophet, Rasulullah, His beloved, as a rahmah. And we should be grateful for that, and we should be able to then curate our works on the basis of those foundations for the rest of humanity. And I want to see us do that now. And that's this book came out from a very emotional moment for me. Post Gaza, I was not
Mm.
in a good space and I was frustrated and I wanted to speak to people and I didn't know how to speak to people and I didn't want to just simply come on a podcast where people listen to me for an hour and a half and bounce. I wanted my voice to travel beyond time and space,
Right.
and that's what books do, right? And I remember signing a book for someone only 2 days ago in Manchester. They said their son is 7 years old. So I wrote in the book that when you get older, I hope you read this because that's what it
Mm.
means to go beyond time. It moves at a different pace.
Absolutely.
And I started to appreciate that writing books are part of our tradition and they matter. So it's not the title in some ways is, you know, why does history matter? But the idea should be why do books matter, right?
Mm.
Because they do, and alhamdulillah for that. So that's the intention behind it. Um, like there's a lot of deficiencies in the book, and since reading it, there are a lot of ideas that I would like to unpack a bit more, and so forth,
No, but
right? But
so
go
go
for
ahead.
it.
No,
But
I think
I want to do that with the community now.
mm. I think no, actually that's one of the really kind of beautiful things about the book for me was kind of the vulnerability and kind of the honesty about what you're speaking about,
Yeah,
and it is a discourse,
yeah,
and it's a great read because it's not like a lot of history books. You're either kind of like the overconfidence in stating some
yeah.
facts, the overconfident, and it's not like you know it's a really nice intervention. I think it's a really kind of open intervention and an invitation to the reader.
Absolutely, yeah. And you know what? There's two things I want to add. One is the way that I trained myself to do history was never to have an absolute position. A friend
Yeah.
of mine taught me that if you have an absolute position, you're going to get cut down, right? And you can't afford to have an absolute position as a historian what I generally do is I try to show people my process of how I got to that conclusion. That you can disagree with it, but this is what I did. This is why I believe what I believe, and to try to be quite honest about it, but also be, as you mentioned, vulnerable about it, and make the case that okay, if you know something I don't, I'm more than happy to make the adjustment on that point, because that's the integrity that a writer should have. And the second point is I remember when I first presented this book in Canada, a friend of mine, Ulla, she's Palestinian, and she came with her husband and kids, and she was the one who was interviewing me at the time, and she had post-it notes all over the book. And I got a little bit nervous because in the academy, academics are trained to just tear you down before you've even spoken.
Yeah.
It's like, where's the hole in your point and your argument? And I was expecting that because, that's just instinct. And yet what she had done is she did something interesting. She built on what I was saying. And then I
Mm,
thought, okay, that's what I was trying to do. So someone like yourself, it's like you're a historian, you're a young academic, you're, a diverse thinker. You take these ideas and then you say, you know what? Okay, that's an interesting point. I think I can build on this. I think I can flesh this out. And in that sense, the humility of the book was that I'm willing to accept that. I'm happy for everyone else to flesh it out,
yeah.
because I actually just want um, us collectively to start doing this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I honestly love that about the book. Um, reading for me is like, I mean, I love reading, but when you read heavy academic work, it's just exhausting. It's mentally taxing, and
Yeah,
especially when it's badly written and it's like very
yeah,
dense English. Whereas I think this was just a really nice read, and it was like I was having a conversation. It was like a very very kind of conversational tone to it.
yeah. I'm sure the
And
editors will complain and think otherwise. I mean, in the beginning, the first draft was a bit sloppy. There was because it was a. I'll be frank with you. It was an idea dump. So the way that I write is I dumped everything on
yeah,
the first version, but as we went through it with the team and so forth, I didn't want to lose my voice in it, and I wanted it to be as simply written as possible because, as you and I both know, academic works are dense.
yeah,
And the idea was how can you take a complex idea but still make it palatable where
yeah.
people can understand it? And I hope that was one of the intentions. I hope that does come across.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. For me, anyway, it was just yeah. I mean, it's what 300 pages, but it felt
Yeah,
very light.
yeah,
Yeah, so that's if that was the aim, it was achieved definitely.
yeah.
Um,
Alhamdulillah.
right, I think we'll finish with that last question. Unless Tanzan, you've got anything?
I mean, I was talking to Nadim at this before the show, but I've got into Ottoman style archery recently. So I have a
Oh, that's amazing.
Bosnian archery teacher. So it'd be
Yeah,
good to just sort of ask you about. So like from what I know and from what he's explained as well, like the Janissary Corps would have done training according to the Sunnah art. So it'd be pretty interesting to understand what that training looked like, and in terms of like things such as horse riding and
right,
archery. How was that utilized during the time of the Ottomans, and yeah, how the Sunnah arts were viewed specifically, and what did they take from like because why like from the tradition that I'm trying to understand, like the way that my archery teacher, shout out to Ustad Ahmed Karat, so we've had him on the show a few times as well. He's based in Sydney, and he always talks from a very spiritual Islamic lens, and it kind of fits in some ways to the themes of what we talked about today, in the sense that we need to think things a bit, deeper, a bit expansive, and that kind of Western narrative we're told. And we talked about Orientalism, that kind of stuff. Like because what he kind of unpacks is like, people talk about archery as if they just want to reach. They want to shoot the target, or they just want to hunt something. Horse
yeah,
riding is done as a utility in the sense that you're either trying to acquire something or get something, but I think Islamically tries to tell us like all those activities are actually meant to be done in a way to make us better Muslims, like spiritually and otherwise, as opposed to just acquire food or
yeah,
do this
absolutely.
and kind of act on the impulse. So it'd just be good to just get your thoughts on those sort of activities as well.
I couldn't give you details on that, but what I can tell you in general, what I've noticed about the Ottomans, for example, calligraphy. Calligraphy is not just simply an art form. Okay, it's not something that just looks beautiful on the wall. That's something that we do today. But in actuality, a friend of mine, he's a calligrapher, and he was explaining to me that the methodology they use, which is the Ottoman methodology, he goes, they do wudu, then they pray, they recite particular tasbih and so forth, and then they start doing the calligraphy, because fundamentally the calligraphy was designed to write the Quran. He goes, today we've got students from around the world who come to just see it as an art form. And he was thinking, like, do we make them do wudu or not? Many of the students are women but don't wear hijab. Shall we ask them to wear hijab or not? Now he was telling me that it was interesting. If you go to Japan or China to learn martial arts, you'll do all the cultural stuff before you do the martial arts. But here, if all those practices are put forward to do, it will be seen as some kind of imposition. And same thing with all the sultans. They all needed to learn a craft, from Abdul Hamid doing carpentry, to some of them being calligraphers, to Sulaiman al-Qanuni polishing diamonds and so forth. And this was that they needed to use their hands in some ways, and it's for religious reasons, as a way of understanding their own sense of being a human. So I'm not surprised. I don't know the details on the Janissaries to make that case, but I've read enough to know that, it's a shame that people do not understand that the Janissaries were Muslim. When I'm in Japan, we're finding toys of ninjas and samurai that are celebrated. And in the Muslim world, we don't celebrate the Janissaries in this way. And it fundamentally is because we don't have any attachment or knowledge of the tasawwuf and religious practices of what the Janissaries did. From the band that they do, to the archery, to, like, recently I've been writing about how the Janissaries were representatives of the Ummah. And this is what people don't appreciate. So I couldn't tell you the details because that's not my area of expertise. But I do know enough in terms of engaging with it that I would agree with your Hoja, regarding the centrality of Islam and Tasawwuf in the practicing of many of these arts, for sure.
Yeah, because on top of that, what you're mentioning, like even with archery, right? Even though we're doing everything, like alhamdulillah, it's done in a way where it's according to the sunnah in that sense. Like when it comes to aligning ourselves with the tasawwuf tradition, in saying that though, even some aspects, just because out of practicality, like people
Yeah.
obviously to get them involved, like they're very curious. So then they obviously go to the beginner class, but even the beginner class is like, if we were to model exactly like the Ottomans, I think what my teacher was saying is like, like even before even shooting the bow, like you have to learn how to like go through the processes of picking up the bow correctly, and you have to do that like 1,000 times on each side, and that takes like forever. So people
Yeah.
aren't gonna end up shooting a bow at all if they kind of follow the actual Ottoman
Yeah.
methodology, right? So then they had to even cut those kind of parts. So it sort of speaks to your point where, unfortunately, like I guess that beauty of really going through the tasawwuf method
Yeah.
is lost because we want to get to that end goal essentially, like which is shooting the bow and have fun and do it for the
Yeah.
aesthetics or maybe for the Instagram pictures, whatever it is. But whereas we're sort of missing that proper training in this day and age, unfortunately. So it is. I've noticed something, yeah, that playing out quite a bit, and mentioned in regards to calligraphy as well. Like I think we spoke to I think it was Ustad, was his name Rizwan? This was a while back,
Yeah,
Nadim, right?
yeah. From Istanbul,
I don't know
actually,
if
as well.
yeah, so he's a calligrapher as well, and the theme that he was talking about as well, like you're learning about patience and focus and being dedicated. Like these are qualities that obviously are prophetic qualities that we have to hone in, and it's similar in archery as well, where obviously you need a lot of focus, dedication, patience, and it's a whole journey, right? Like I've only
Absolutely.
started to hit this situation where. Um, when I've realized that I've tried to put expectations on myself, and then you're working too hard, and then you sort of force yourself to be at a certain level, and then you don't achieve that outcome. And that's kind of a spiritual process where it's like, why am I so fixated on trying to get to a certain level? Like I have to trust the process, trust Allah, be in the
That's
moment
right.
present,
That's right.
do that self-reflection. So like it is a whole journey. And similar with archery as well, with horse riding as well, um, like when I did a bit of the horsemanship course that they have, the whole principle is like once you learn how to tame a horse, a wild horse, then you'll know how to raise a family basically, or raise a child, because you're trying to learn all these nuances about the horse that what
Right.
makes them tick, because each horse is different obviously, and the way that they've gone through trauma is different. So it's about understanding. You don't want
absolutely.
to be too jumpy. You have to hold them a certain way. You have to approach them a certain way. You have to walk at their pace. And this takes hours and hours and hours. So it can be very excruciating. A lot of patience is required. But these are all qualities that we're trying to build as
That's
Muslims. So
amazing. That's amazing.
yeah, so alhamdulillah, like yeah, so that's what it's just kind of a reminder, like it kind of ties in exactly what we're talking about because I think
And that is history as well. It's history and it's like lived experience. Do you know what I mean?
100%, yeah, and that's why I try to get involved in that sense because it's
Yeah,
important. Like, there's so many ways, I guess what you call like living in the West, how it's kind of shaped us, and
yeah,
it's like talking about your point about the Malaika and how Jibril alayhi salam like came down Mount Hira and how that is perceived. Like so many examples of that. Like we have to undo, like kind of go that decolonize
yeah,
Muslim minds and get to
yeah.
the actual essence of, I guess, why we have to become better Muslims. And so yeah, sorry,
Absolutely.
that's my little ramble, but I
No,
don't know
it's
if you had any other
fantastic.
thoughts.
I
Yeah.
really appreciate it. Thank you. No, honestly, I learned something as well. So I really appreciate your intervention. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it was just it was an interesting combination in the sense that my archery teacher kind of because there's also very interesting, like even the Ottoman style archery is a lot different to the Western style archery. Like we use a technique called a thumb shooting,
Yeah,
and the way that you pull, I actually have my bow, but it's in my garage. But the way you pull the bow, you
yeah,
have to like point your finger, and then that finger is kind of made reference to our prayer. You know when you do
yeah.
to
It's
show.
good.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so like they try to incorporate parts of our
yeah,
prayer into the way that we do
yeah,
the bow, which is really fascinating, alhamdulillah. But obviously, you don't have that. Like when you learn archery from just you go to the normal, I don't know, archery range,
yeah.
nearby or within your neighborhood. You're not taught all of this kind of stuff. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So yeah, alhamdulillah, definitely. That's why I got
Alhamdulillah.
super involved. But I don't know if you
Yeah.
had, any other thoughts about anything with that.
No, I don't, unfortunately. But I was just fascinating listening to you, to be honest.
Alhamdulillah. Yeah, so I'll pass on to Nadeem. I don't know if you had any final thoughts, inshallah.
No, shall we just finish with our final question about who you want to hang out with in a cave?
Yeah, yeah, go for it. Yeah, you can ask.
Go for it, Tanzim, go for it.
Oh, me? Okay. So usually we ask. I don't mean. Sometimes you remember,
We
but
don't always
uh,
ask.
yeah, we don't always ask because we forget. But if you were to hang with three people in a cave, it could be anyone from living in the present or from the past. Who would it be? And we have to sort of exclude the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba and the prophets because everyone kind of picks them. So we want something a bit, different name, and probably not like some of the more prominent scholars. So someone you probably read about that you'd be interested to hang out with a
So
in the
number
in the,
one
in the
at the
cave.
moment, it does sound really silly, but it is Jibreel alayhi salam. It sounds bizarre. Because I'm writing about an angel and the messenger of messengers in many ways. And I've become so fascinated and intrigued about Jibreel alayhi salam. And so intrigued about this angel that would speak to the Anbiya and would come with a message to the Anbiya and the one, who engages with Allah Ta'ala and so forth. And so for me, he's, I get it, he's not human, he's an angel, but it's just this intrigue. And I remember speaking to a friend of mine who said something to me once that stuck with me. He goes, I really love Jibreel alayhi salam. And I go, yeah, we should love him because he's part of Iman. He goes, no, but I really love him. And then I thought to myself, you know what? I've never thought of it like that because for him it was something really important, and so for me that would be number one. Number two, I think as an Ottoman historian, more intriguingly, I would love to sit down with Sultan Abdulhamid II. I've written a lot about Sultan Abdulhamid II. I'm intrigued and fascinated by him. I'm intrigued and fascinated by him as a ruler of the Muslim world. And then finally, a more contemporary thinker would be Mustafa Sabri Effendi, just because I've engaged so much with the works and ideas of Mustafa Sabri, that somebody who I'm very consistent, it feels very consistent to me as a person, and it is definitely somebody that I would love to have engaged from. I mean, his world was phenomenal in terms of his lived experience from coming from a village from Tokat to being the librarian of Abdul Hamid II to getting involved in the Young Turk Revolution to going into exile into Romania and then a monastery in Greece and then coming back and becoming the Sheikh al-Islam of the Ottoman Empire, and then moving to Egypt, and then coming back to Istanbul, then going to Saudi, then going back to Egypt, and then living up until the days of Gamal Abdel Nasser. Imagine he saw Abdul Hamid II and he saw Gamal Abdel Nasser. That stretch is phenomenal for me. So yeah, it'd be Jibreel alayhi salam, because I'm writing about him at the moment and I'm just fascinated by him. Abdul Hamid II, because he's somebody that's been really integral to the work that I've done, and I really do hope that whatever I've written about Abdul Hamid has been as honest and as reflective as he was, because I really do know that I don't know him, even though I've written so much about him. And then Mustafa Sabri Effendi, because he's just a scholar that has really shaped the way I think as a person.
Yeah, mashallah. I think covered a lot of ground, alhamdulillah, and I think it was a very insightful podcast in that sense. Hopefully, like you feel like, because I've listened to it for some time actually, and it's funny. Mahin from Mad Mamluks, he's
Oh yeah,
on
yeah,
Sultans and
yeah.
Seekers now, so I know he was mentioning to me because we're friends as well.
Fantastic.
Like they have that kind of relationship there. So it was a great honor to have you on to
Thank you
finally
all
chat.
for having me.
Inshallah, we can definitely have another conversation. Maybe we can talk about specifically details
Yeah,
about
whenever you want. I really
Ottomans.
appreciate you having me.
No, I appreciate it. Alhamdulillah. I don't know if you have final thoughts, Nadeem, before we wrap up.
Oh yeah, just Jazakallah khair.
Barakallahu feek.
Look, really, it's really a pleasure having you on here.
Yeah.
I hope we'll have you on again soon.
Yeah, and inshallah, honestly, I really look forward to you pursuing history again. We need those voices. We need multiple voices. Don't, go back into the books, bro.
Yeah, inshallah. Yeah, and I want to do some more writing. It's exactly what you say though. It's kind of what are the avenues,
Yeah,
and how do you make it accessible and kind of relevant to today? I think I had the exact same kind of reckoning as you. I think I kind of gave up on it for a little while, and then when Gaza happened,
yeah,
like, okay, hold on, I need to go back and do something here.
inshallah,
So, inshallah,
inshallah. I look forward to it.
inshallah.
Thank you.
Inshallah. So yeah, we'll probably wrap it up there. So for our listeners, thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions or queries, feel free to reach out to us on our social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook. We're on, you can email us at boysinthecave at gmail.com. And also, yeah, subscribe to us on Spotify. We're on YouTube. We're on Apple iTunes as well. Inshallah. So for our special guest, Dr. Yakoob, and I wish you all the best. This is Nadeem and I signing off. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.